If you want to explore tabletop gaming, but painting hundreds of little game pieces frightens or confuses you, then you need to watch this video. My name is Jesse and I am that tabletop guy. In this video, I'm going to show you a simple 3-step process to painting good looking minis quickly and easily for your next gaming session. Using this process, you can paint miniatures for Dungeons & Dragons, Warhammer, and a host of other board games and tabletop games. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll need a few simple things, all of which you'll find linked in the description down below. And if you use any of the links to purchase these items, I'll get a small commission which will help support the channel and keep me making videos. First, you'll need acrylic paints, a palette, and some brushes. Now I recommend just getting a cheap pack of brushes off Amazon, get a cheap plastic palette, and a starter kit of about 10 miniature paints. Yes, you can use craft paints, but you'll have a better experience with miniature paints made specifically for what we're going to do. Finally, you'll need a basic 10-color oil paint set and some mineral spirits for the second step of this process. Now in this video, we're going to be working with a mini that's already been primed, and a lot of miniatures off the shelf do come pre-primed, but if your miniature is unprimed, you'll need to prime it first. For this, I recommend a spray can of primer that you can get at your local big box hardware store or your local game shop, which may carry miniature specific primer. If you need a tutorial on how to prime your mini, hit subscribe and that video will be coming along very shortly. The first step in our 3-step process is to apply a base layer of paint to cover up the primer on the mini. This is called the base coat and it gives a good solid foundation for our highlights and our shading. When applying the base coat, it's important that we do not create any texture with the paint due to our brush strokes. This means we need to thin our paint so that it goes on nice and smooth without globbing out the details and without leaving any visible brush strokes. When I thin my paint, I like to aim for a consistency similar to milk, which means the paint is smooth, doesn't leave ridges, and it has a good opacity so it gets good coverage. The more you thin your paint, the less opaque it becomes, and the more coats it will take to get the same coverage. So the trade-off here is that thinner paint goes on smoother, is less likely to leave unwanted texture, and less likely to glop up the details of the mini. But on the other hand, you do have to put on more coats. I believe someone famous on YouTube said 2 thin coats is the way to go. And that's kind of the process I subscribe to, although for me, I typically take 3 to 4 coats to get good desired coverage. Once the paint is thinned, it's time to apply the base coat. Remember these things. Only load your brush up about halfway. Always pull the brush, don't push the brush. And once you place the stroke, leave it. Acrylic paint begins to dry very quickly, and if you go back over that same stroke before it's fully set but has already started to dry, you could tear up that layer of paint, leaving a very ugly and unsightly ridge behind. Once the entire mini has a base coat and has thoroughly dried, this step is very important, must thoroughly dry. I typically leave my miniatures to dry overnight or while I'm at work, about at least a good solid couple of hours. Once that's done, it's time to move on to our step 2, which is going to be applying an oil wash to our miniature. The second step in this process is to mix up an oil wash and apply it liberally to the mini. This oil wash is going to seep down into all the cracks and crevices of the mini and deposit color there so we can use it to apply our shading to give some good contrast to our mini. I know oil paints may seem a little intimidating, but just follow along and you'll be just fine. To mix up an oil wash, I pour some mineral spirits into a plastic Dixie cup. I squeeze some paint out under my brush, and then I mix it into the mineral spirits until it's a nice watery consistency and the color is where I like it. I may take a couple of tries to get everything just right. I load my brush up and I press it against the side of the cup to test the consistency and the color to make sure everything is exactly the way I want it. And it'll take me a few attempts to get the color just right. In this example here, I mixed up some blue wash because I thought the color would be more purple than it was, and I didn't really like how blue it was, so I added in a little bit of red and then a little bit of black to get the color exactly right. And once you're done mixing up your wash, dip your brush in and apply it all over the mini. Be very liberal with the oil wash. You'll want to put on as much as the mini will take, and at some point the oil wash will start to drip off the mini onto your table, and that's perfectly fine, and you know you've gotten good coverage when that happens. So the more oil wash you apply, the more intense shading you will get, which is desirable because we don't want to have to go back and paint in all the shadows by hand. Once the oil wash is applied, I set the model aside for a few minutes. Usually I listen to 1 or 2 songs on my Spotify playlist, so I guess it would be about 4 to 8 minutes of drying time. Once that's done and the oil wash is set up a little bit, I take a cotton swab and I gently rub off the areas where I don't want the shading to apply. So any broad flat surfaces and any upward facing surfaces that would be naturally be lit by the light from the sky. Rub off the wash so it doesn't dry there, and then when you're done removing the wash from the areas you don't want, I usually like to set it aside to dry overnight, as oil washes can take a little longer to dry than acrylic. So once the oil wash is applied and dried, you can stop here and have a perfectly fine looking miniature all ready to go for your gaming sessions. But if you want to take it a step further and you really want to impress your friends who don't paint miniatures, well, honestly here, what we got done in these 2 steps will impress pretty much anyone who doesn't know anything about painting miniatures, but this next step is really going to take that miniature to the extra next level here. And that is going to be going over and applying some highlights to really amp up the contrast on your mini and just make all those little details just jump right out to your eyeballs. So I don't typically do the highlighting step on every single miniature I paint. If I'm doing a warband or if I'm doing a bunch of miniatures for an RPG encounter, typically the important miniatures, the commanders, the big boss, and anything else that's important to the scene will get the highlights, and everyone else will just get the 2 steps of the 3-step process. Finally, we're to step 3. The last step of this process is to add more contrast to the mini via highlighting. The goal of this step is to apply a lighter version of our base coat to the upward facing surfaces that would naturally catch the light and be a little bit lighter in color than the bottom facing surfaces or the up and down facing surfaces. So first what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of our base coat and we're going to go back over our mini and we're going to clean up that shading a little bit by painting over the areas where the wash is dried, but the shading doesn't quite look right. Maybe we got some wash on an upward facing surface that we missed, or we have some wash that kind of seeped out where we didn't want it to. Just go back over it with your base coat and it'll just be like it never happened. Once we've gone through and we've cleaned up the mini, our next step is to mix up a lighter version of that base coat, which you could do by adding a little bit of white and mixing it in, or just grabbing a lighter color of that same hue off your paint rack. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to hit all the upward facing surfaces with this lighter color. Now, once you get this first round of highlights done, you could stop here. But if you want to get that extra credit assignment done, take an even lighter version of your base coat, and you go back over and paint increasingly smaller layers over the previous layers, allowing them to thoroughly dry in between each application until you get points of light that are really brightly pushed up into near white on your miniature. Now, honestly, I don't go that far in my highlights. I could go farther, but I don't, because when you're painting up 12 to 18 miniatures for a game, you do kind of got to move a little quickly unless you want to spend a week or 2 prepping these miniatures for your game. So I'll typically go 1 round of highlighting, maybe 2 if I have a little bit extra time. But again, you can layer these highlights up as far as you want and into as bright of a color as you want, because after all, it's your miniature, it's your art, you do it the way you like it. So when I first started highlighting, one thing I struggled a lot with was the color selection. I have always paranoid about trying to jump too far in value too quickly, which value means how light or dark a color is. So if my base coat was blue, I was always stuck at trying to figure out what the next lighter shade of blue should be to apply a highlight to that. Well, if you apply too bright of a highlight, don't worry. Just take your base coat, thin it down even more than what you did for your base coat layer. I would say about 2 or 3 times as much, and then go back over that really thin paint, and that's going to act as a glaze, which is going to tone down the brightness of that color and kind of blend it all together nice and smooth. Again, optional extra step, but if you want to take your miniature painting from game ready standards up and start working towards those competition standards, this is a great step to take. And there we have it. We have a fully painted miniature that only took us a few hours. I think this miniature here took me 5 hours total, and that was including the recording time and setting up the camera and all that stuff to record this. Using a few simple steps, So like I said before, this won't win any competitions, and it certainly won't impress any of the big miniature painting YouTubers like Goobertown Hobbies out there. But it will definitely impress your friends who have never painted a miniature before, and are probably looking at their unpainted miniatures and feeling just a little bit jealous now. Which is great, because if they want to paint their minis up, just send them over to this video, and they'll get started, and then you have the beginnings of a little painting club of your own. If you have any questions about any of these steps, leave them in the comments down below, and I will address them in future videos. I am planning a more detailed set of videos to follow this one, to take each of these steps and really dive deep into it. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below so I can include them in that video. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button, because it helps the algorithm send this video out to more people, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Thanks for watching, and go get your tabletop on.